Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Today, we're talking about how to have better conversations with award-winning journalist Celeste Headlee. She's the author of We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. And her TED Talk, 10 Ways to Have Better Conversations, has been viewed more than 17 million times. Celeste's years of interview experience as a host for NPR gives her a unique perspective on what makes for a good conversation. In our world of email and text messages, people are actually feeling less connected than ever before. The only way forward, Celeste says, is to start talking to each other. On today's episode, Celeste shares the simple communication tools she has learned that can help us have more effective and more meaningful conversations in every facet of our lives. Let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Celeste Headlee. So Celeste Headlee, what a treat to have you on. It is truly a pleasure. Thank you for taking a minute.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and it's good to talk to you again.
It's fun. So what inspired your TED Talk, which has had an impact on so many people in such a wonderful way? Tell me what inspired that.
So they gave me a prompt to write the TED Talk, and the prompt was, think about something that's going wrong in the world, and then tell us how to fix it. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about that because, you know, if you're going to tell people how to fix something, you have to have that answer, right? But the thing that was bothering the most was how people were, A, not talking to each other as much as we have in past years, and B, when we do talk to each other, we weren't actually having conversations. We were just talking at other people. And I said, you know, I happen to know how to fix that. And so that's why I gave the TED Talk. Although I've got to be totally honest with you, I really did not expect it to go viral at all. So that was a shock.
That's what happens when you push out good content.
Yeah, I figured people are going to see the word conversation and be like, ugh. And, you know, I didn't put on makeup or wear anything nice. So, yeah.
Well, it was powerful. And then you went on to write your book, which is called We Need to Talk. And I love this title because, you know, when you hear those words, when we as people hear we need to talk, right, we think, oh gosh, we sort of, our throat, right, you know, we get a little pit in our stomach and think, what is it about that we as human beings are sort of afraid of, right, and fearful of these sort of important kinds of conversations? You know,
you've really zeroed in on a really important thing because at heart, one of the reasons I think the title works so well is because we really are avoiding conversation. I mean, how many times per day do you see an actual phone call coming in and without even thinking, you just send them straight to voicemail, right? And then people get annoyed when people leave voicemails. they would rather that you text. So, like, we're really avoiding voice-to-voice conversations at every possible opportunity. So I think the title works really well for that. But what you've zeroed in on, that fear, it turns out that decades of scientific research actually shows it is, in fact, fear that makes us avoid talking to other people. Not necessarily fear about what they're going to say to you. It's fear about your own social awkwardness. It's fear about not coming off well, about not being funny, about saying something racist or sexist. It's fears about the way you come off. And you know, it's really interesting. There's this brilliant researcher, Gillian Sandstrom at the University of Essex, and she published a study with her colleagues last year called The Liking Gap. And basically, after some very long, like in one case, a year-long experiment, she discovered that people like us more than we think.
Interesting.
We're so wrapped up in our own self-consciousness, we're completely missing all the social cues they're giving off that show they don't think we're socially awkward at all. It's our own fears that are preventing us from truly seeing that the other person is enjoying our conversation.
Interesting. Interesting. So how did you go about, studying this issue of conversation, and what was it that sort of bubbled up in you that said, We got an issue"? I mean, there's obvious things, right? Like phones and texting and all this technology that's entered our world, but what else?
So the reason I started actually having to dig into it is because the first thing I did when I was starting I wanted to become a better interviewer, basically. And so I started doing all the research I could on conversations because, as you know perfectly well, an interview is just a more formalized conversation,
Sure,
right? At
sure.
heart, it's just a good conversation, or should be. But when I read all the advice that was out there from experts, and then I tried it, sat down in my studio and tried out, today, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to maintain eye contact, right? Like I really tried it. It didn't work. And in fact, in most cases, the things they were advising made the conversation worse. And it just made me realize we have, for generations, been teaching each other how to pretend that we're listening. Here's how you make it look and sound like you're listening to another person. And what I realized is I started to do research, and the groundbreaking, seminal research of Ralph Nichols, who we call the father of listening. After an entire career spent studying human listening, his takeaway was human beings are bad listeners. We're just not designed to do it really well. We have to force ourselves to do it. It burns a tiny amount of glucose. It burns energy to do it, not enough to help you lose weight. But it's hard for us. And so therefore, we've been training people in public speaking for all these years when what we really needed to do was train them in listening.
Well, there's that old saying, we have two ears, right, and one mouth. And when we're talking, we're not learning.
That's correct.
Right? When we're talking, we're not learning. So that's interesting. So what does make a good conversation?
So a real conversation is a mutual exchange of ideas. And what that means is that if you walk away from a conversation having learned nothing or retained nothing of what you heard, you didn't have a conversation.
Got
and
it.
I mean,
Yeah.
Not necessarily remembering what you said. It's what did you learn something from what the other person said? And if you didn't, you were talking at them.
Well, any other advice as I begin this interview with you that I can really make sure that I nail it in your eyes?
I would say my standard advice to almost every interview is keep your questions brief and to the point.
Got it. All right. Well, then here we go. How does this apply to the business world?
Everything in business is about conversations. And it is shocking to me that the amount of business that has been relegated to email, because in all of the research that we have, email is an incredibly substandard form of communication. The number one cause of project failure in the business world is miscommunication. And the number one cause of miscommunication is overuse of email. And yet we have businesses, big businesses like Coca-Cola and JP Morgan, that use their telephones so little they've taken voicemail off of the system. So in the business world, we kind of have to rediscover how to converse with one another again. I would sit in my office and my employees would be sitting maybe 15 feet away from my door, and they'd send me emails.
Mm-hmm. That's
and
sad.
I would lean out the door and say, "I deleted that. What do you
doing? Need? Let's talk."
I know. Come to my office,
Uh-huh.
for God's sake. Email feels more efficient, and the reason it feels more efficient is because when you're writing it for an audience of one, and that's you. So of course it's clear to you. Of course it's respectful to you. You have no idea at that point whether the other person is actually reading what you think you wrote, or whether they think it's respectful, or what tone they have in their heads when they're reading it. So in fact, email is an incredibly inefficient communication tool, and it's only valuable in 4 instances, and I'll tell you what they are. They are sending attachments, sending long missives, like what you would have sent someone a long letter in the days when we wrote letters.
Mm-hmm.
Sending any kind of list, agendas, delegating authority, outlines of things, the project timelines, et cetera, any version of list. And the 4th one is praise. Email is actually quite effective as praise. And we think it's because people like to read it again and again and then share it with other people. But other than those 4 things, email is almost never your best communication tools. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule, But in almost every case, email is not the best communication tool outside of those 4 instances.
Well, and I'm imagining somebody who's listening that says, well, I have a team of 7 direct reports and I need to tell them all the same thing and they're in different markets. I can't, have a call with them every single day with different updates that we need to run through. So they send an email to sort of communicate in bulk to a group of people that are remote. What advice do you have for somebody in that space?
Yeah, so that's kind of a list, right? Like, here's a list of things everyone needs to know.
Okay.
That's totally fine. The problem is when someone has a question or they're confused and they use email to try to clear up confusion.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So if one of those employees is confused by something on that list or on that agenda or whatever it may be, they need to pick up the phone at that point. Because as soon as an email involves nuance or emotion or anything like detailed and difficult to explain, it is no longer your best communication tool.
Sure. One of the things we say in our negotiation workshops is if you want a deal to not get done, send it in an email. Send the terms, send the deal points, communicate via email, and that deal won't get done.
Research shows that when we write in emails, even the nicest person on the planet, you are less likely to negotiate, you're less likely to cooperate, you are more likely to escalate conflict.
Sure. Well, and in your book, you say that that poor communication costs us up to $73 billion a year.
Yeah.
Write that down for me.
What they had to do to come up with that number is look at a few businesses, calculate what the costs are per person, and then sort of expand that number out to include all businesses. And of course, that includes business. That when they did that survey, it included businesses of 100 people or more.
Okay.
So it doesn't include smaller businesses, or that total would go even higher. But here you have to think. Let me give you a really good example. When my book was getting ready to come out, I was negotiating with another company that wanted to use me as a consultant. And they sent an email saying, this is what we want to do. I forwarded that email on to my publisher and said, just want to check this, make sure this is all okay with you. And then what followed after that was an exchange of more than 150 emails taking 2.5 months of time until I finally said, this has to stop. This is ridiculous. Talk on the phone, please.
Sure.
And they got it solved in less than 20 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah. So when you're talking about businesses where that kind of delay costs money, and also when you consider that email takes up a minimum of 25% of a typical worker's day. So if a lot of that email is totally unnecessary, then that's why the cost is so high.
Sure.
We're sending emails that are completely unnecessary and just a complete waste of time.
Well, and driving more disconnection.
Yeah.
Inside of that process. So, smartphones, right? So let's talk about this. You talk about it in the book a little bit, that the presence of a phone actually hurts the quality of the conversation and the strength, right, of the connection between the two people in the conversation or more than that in the conversation. So tell me about smartphones and technology and how they play into our conversations, whether they're being used or not. And what is you're in the media where you have to stay at some level connected. So what is your relationship with your smartphone?
So this is really interesting because this particular bit of research is sort of formed the nugget of what my next book is going to be about. Because I started asking myself, are smartphones to blame? Is it because of social media and smartphones that all this is going wrong? And when it comes down to it, the answer is no. Smartphones are a tool at heart. When we're talking like biologically and evolutionarily, that's all they are. And the same with social media. It's a communication tool. Now, there's nothing wrong with tools. Human beings have been using tools since minimum the Stone Age. And it's so natural to us that when you pick up a screwdriver, your brain treats that screwdriver as though it were an extension of your arm. Like, that's how natural it is for a human being to hold a tool. The problem isn't the tool itself. It's that when we finish putting together a bookcase, we set the tool down. Our brains are not designed to hold a tool in our hands 24/7. And I do mean that, since there's a fairly large number of people who admit they hold their cell phones when they're sleeping.
Yikes.
Yeah. So, in terms of smartphones, they're not the problem. The problem is our inherent avoidance of of conversation with other people, of interaction with other people, and even more so, and I think this is part of the reason why Americans suffer from some of these tendencies more than other nations. In fact, Americans, Canada, and the UK particularly, when you idealize and sort of worship individualism, when you think that it's the individual, right, the self-made man, that when it's all about that the person and it's not about community, it tends to make you think you can do everything on your own. And that, again, that's not how human beings are designed. There's almost nothing we do better alone than in a group. Almost nothing. So when it comes to the smartphone, it's not the problem. It's just making it easier for us to avoid what we were already trying to avoid.
So what advice do you have for people on how to navigate their relationship with it better in order to enhance their ability to connect?
So as you alluded to, I have to keep up all the time.
Sure.
My advice is the first thing that you have to do is you have to decide, what do you think is reasonable? So the very first thing that I did is I sat down and I figured out, what is it that I do all day? How am I spending my time? So every, couple hours, I had a little notebook and I noted down in half-hour increments, what did I do? So I could sort of see how long I was spending on social media.
Did you feel like an attorney for a minute?
In a way, like billable hours, yes. In a way. And frankly, it was not a pretty picture. I was not spending my time the way I thought I was. So that's the first thing, is sort of being honest about how much time you are spending doing these things. And then you have to ask yourself, I had to ask myself, okay, so how much time do I think is reasonable for social media, right? Like if you're awake the average of 16 hours a day, and a certain amount of that is going to be eating or whatever, out of those 16 hours, how much of that time do I think I should spend on social media? And I thought like 90 minutes. Like even that seems high, because 16 hours is not a lot. And that meant I had to put limits on it. I had to decide, when am I going to be doing that? Now, that's not a hard and fast limit for me. There's some days when news is really breaking and I'm going to be on more. But then there's other days when I'm going to be on less, like it's flexible. But still, what I do is every hour I check my email real quick, and I check my social media, and then I close them.
Okay, and get back to work on other things.
I get back to work, and I focus, and I don't check back.
Do you do that on the hour? I mean, is it like an on-the-hour thing? You check it, and how long are you on it?
Yeah, like every hour.
Okay, and how long are you on it when you do that?
It depends. Like if I open up my email and there's like 20 emails in there, it can take me a little longer. For probably like 5 or 10 minutes out of the day. But also in the days when my work day is done, I don't check it again. I don't do that anymore.
And how do you feel? You feel better?
Killing me. Oh my God. It's like a revelation. And I'm deleting my accounts on Facebook, by the way, in just a few days. It's incredible. We all feel so pressed for time, but it turns out we actually have more time than we think. It's our habits are actually making us feel overwhelmed. It's not that the feeling is not real. It's real. But it's a result of our habits rather than sort of necessary tasks.
So when we think about conversations, real quick, let's just dial this back for a second. What advice would you give people just at the most basic level to say, hey, here's the 2 or 3 things I would challenge people to think about on how to have better conversations?
I mean, so the first one, you always have to start with listening. And one of the most difficult things to do is that when you're listening to someone, your brain is going to be constantly feeding information to you. And this is natural and it's necessary. Your brain is trying to give you context and information to help you understand what you're hearing. But the hard part of it is you can't let that distract you. You have to let your brain give it to you, and you can just say, noted, and then go back to listening to the other person. What really happens, and this again comes from that great quote from Stephen Covey when he said, we're always listening not with the intent to understand, but with the intent to reply. So someone's talking to us. Within a few seconds, we think of what we want to say in response, and we stop listening. That's it. We're just waiting for them to stop talking so that we can say what we're going to say. And so that would be the first thing, is try to break that habit. And I get that it's going to be hard. That's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing I would say is keep it short. Our attention spans are shrinking anyway, but frankly, you really don't have more than say 30 seconds, at the most 60 seconds before you've lost someone's attention completely. And so if you're the type of person that tends to say a whole litany of things or tell a whole story, try to keep it short and brief. I try to think of it like the Sesame Street model. Because, if you watch kids programming, you see that the way that they teach is by keeping the kid engaged and inviting them to interact, right? They'll say, hey, what does the sky look outside? Tell me. And they want the kid to interact with the TV. We think that's how kids learn. That's actually how humans learn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We want to interact also. So let your conversational partner be interactive.
Sure.
Don't go on and on and on. Let them respond. Ask them a question. Let them engage with you, and then you can return to what you were saying.
Well, and I used to tell my athletes, right? I mean, the tighter they keep it, right, the less they're going to talk themselves into a hole and get themselves in trouble, particularly with the media, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So keep it tight. And same thing. That was kind of what I would tell them. So there, those are great tips on how to have better conversations. What are some of the myths that you share?
I mean, I think that one of the biggest myths is that you can learn how to have conversations. We have this tendency to really like hacks lately, or the one secret to be successful, right? How to hack your creativity, all this stuff. We tend to think there's a hack. And so that's one of the biggest myths. There's no hack. I try to tell people all the time, my book is not a self-help book. You're not going to walk away from this going, okay, if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then I'll be a great conversationalist. It's more like going to the gym, to bring it back to athletes.
Mm-hmm.
An athlete can't go to the gym and be like, oh, I got a great pump, I'm done forever. It's a daily discipline and exercise, and that's the same thing with conversation. Is that it's going to every day be a challenge. Some days you won't feel like doing it. Really won't feel like doing it, and that's okay. Just like it's okay to take a day off the gym and relax those muscles.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, one of the biggest myths that there is
that you can change it quickly, right? Start by listening more.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other myth is that the problem is other people. The number one type of question I get is about how do I change the way someone else speaks to me? How do I stop people from interrupting me? How do I stop people from running on and on and on and on and on? And it may be the case that you're talking to a lot of people who have no conversational skills. But we are way more accurate at identifying other people's flaws than we are at identifying our own.
Sure, our own blind spots.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, get rid of this illusion that it's all the other person.
Straight from the book, it says human beings aren't capable of multitasking. And I am a recovering multitasker, literally. And I know there's a lot of people listening probably that are too. And we have new devices that prompt us to be able to multitask easier. Can you give some data around why we need to stop multitasking and the impact that it has on our ability to execute, to connect?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a really great point because, okay, yes, number one, scientifically, we cannot multitask. When your brain tries to do two things at a time, it's just basically trying to switch back and forth as quickly as possible. And what you end up having is a switch, what researchers call a switch cost. So you lose a few seconds every time you switch. Now, think about this for a second. How often you switch from one tab to another tab, to email, to your texting. Think about over the course of just an hour, how often you are asking your brain to switch tasks, and then multiply that by a few seconds at a time. So you're losing a vast amount of time just by not allowing yourself to focus on one thing at a time. It's also such a high cognitive cost that they've discovered that when you have even your email client open on your computer, say in the background, your brain is thinking about that email client, even if you're not consciously looking at it, and your IQ drops by a couple points. So, I mean, there's that. But there's even a long-term cost to multitasking. Just to really drill this point home,
Okay.
what they have found is that if you're the type of person that multitasks often, over time, it degrades your cognitive abilities permanently. So it's not worth it. I mean, every time you try to multitask, the attempt shoots a little shot of dopamine into your brain, which makes you maybe feel like you're being more productive. It maybe gives you a little shot of pleasure, but it's going to exhaust you in the end. And the quality of your works goes down. There are some researchers that have shown that you lose 40% of your productive time to switch costs. The quality of your work goes down by about 25% or so, and you lose IQ points. Like, there's just nothing good I can say that is good about multitasking.
Well, it was funny. I was at a workshop one time, and I thought, this whole multitasking thing, all these people telling me I can't do this. This is crazy. I can do this, right? I mean, and the instructor came up to me, and I said, I don't know if I'm buying this. I mean, I think I can do this. And she said, all right, cool. So she said, do me a favor, take this note card. And she said, give me directions from your house to your children's school verbally. Tell me the directions. But at the same time, what I want you to do is write the alphabet on this card. She goes, you ready? I said, go. She goes, go. I got to like D before I couldn't do it. And there's lots of ways to sort of prove that point. That was one way that she did it. But that was pretty powerful for me. And I would encourage people listening, try that, because I don't know, maybe I'm not smart enough, but I couldn't do it. And I thought, wow, I think I've got to really dig into this multitasking thing and make an adjustment.
Yeah, there's a tiny, tiny percentage of people who are able to multitask in a limited way without a drop in cognitive function. But look, the statistics are you're probably not one of them. Right. You may think you're one of them, but that's not how statistics work.
So sort of switching gears a little bit, I think, inside of conversations, it's so natural for us to want to fill space when there's a pause and there's silence, and people are afraid of silence. And we actually have a chapter in my book called The Power of the Pause.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. So what role does the pause have in having good conversations?
It actually plays a really big role. Sometimes that pause is what allows you to gather your thoughts. All those thoughts that are sort of racing through your mind that you can't stop. I want to be clear about that. There's no such thing as clearing your mind. So if you're taking a pause to sort of consider and sift through, it then allows you, it's much easier for you to then focus again. It means that you're thinking before you speak, which is always a good idea.
And that maybe you're really listening.
Exactly. That's another thing, is that sometimes when I'm interviewing some really, really smart people, sometimes after I've asked a question, there's a pause because they're considering it. And that's when I know that the answer I'm about to get is going to be good, because they've really thought it through. And we rarely do that. And the last thing I'd say is that the pause, sometimes the other person rushes in to fill it. And you can sometimes hear some really unexpected and interesting things just because people will keep talking, because we somehow fear that the commas.
Sure. So speaking of interviews and some of the people you've interviewed, who have been some of the most interesting people that you've interviewed?
So I mentioned in the book Salman Rushdie and why I love him so much, so I won't talk about him again. But I think that some of the most interesting people are rarely the celebrities. For example, I spoke with a very young immunologist who was fighting Ebola when we had the Ebola outbreak. She worked for the CDC. And just her stories of what she did every day and the risks that she took and why she did it. And she talked a little bit about the argument she'd had with her family, right? They were not happy that she was heading off to West Africa to a place where Ebola was everywhere. I mean, that was, to me, was fascinating. But there's also other things, like some of the interviews I did this series of stories for NPR from Michigan, and people who had created sort of gigantic, large-scale art installations in their houses or on their property for no reason, but just to make them, right? And some of those were just fascinating. What motivated them? What kept them going.
Sure.
Yeah, right? I mean, these little stories that people have.
Yeah. So it wasn't the most famous. It was the most potentially interesting is what I'm hearing you. And sometimes those don't always go together.
Yeah, because the celebrities, they've given 1 billion interviews. Like, they've answered almost every question before. This to them is a job to them. The challenge when you're interviewing, and I don't need to tell you this, but the challenge is always to ask a question that's never been asked.
Right. So you've been just getting barraged with 20 that you've never heard before in the last 30 minutes.
No, you are asking good questions.
I'm kidding.
But that's always the challenge, right?
No question.
Because you want them to think about it.
Sure. So when we think about your interviews, it's sort of a lab, I bet, for you to sort of test your ideas. And you've said that before. Tell me about an interview that you did and you had it planned out and you had it scripted and it didn't really go the way you thought and what you learned from it.
Well, there's 2 different kinds. Like the one I would think about, and I apologize, I've forgotten her name, but the older African-American woman who carried out or helped to invent a lot of the recipes that made Paula Deen famous. And she worked for Paula Deen for a very long time. She finally broke away from Deen and wrote her own cookbook. And the cookbook is fantastic. And I couldn't wait to talk to her. And I did all my research and all this stuff. And she wasn't talkative. And no matter what I tried,
Fun.
Yeah, I got like 4 or 5 word answers every time. There's that. You could be the best conversationalist in the world. And since this is my field, I have to assume I'm at least in the top 10%. And sometimes it's not going to work, right? I mean, that's
Sure.
just the way
Well,
that
it takes
is.
2 to have a conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but the other worst conversations or interviews I've had are usually with politicians.
Well, tell me.
Well, because there's a couple reasons. First is that they come prepared to say things, and no matter what question you ask them, they're going to supply their already
Canned answer.
their talking point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're not actually listening. The other thing is that, and this is relatively recent, interviews with politicians become adversarial.
Mm-hmm.
Like every conversation is seen as a debate.
Interesting, because they're trying to push their point out.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's so irritating and boring.
So switching gears, you have another book coming out that you teed up before we went on, and it sounds like a really cool book. It's about efficiency and productivity. Give us a sneak peek into that book. When's it coming out? All that kind of, and the content in it sounds fantastic.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the questions that I came away with after I finished the first book was, why do we do this? Honestly. Like, if voice-to-voice conversation is so much more efficient and effective, and it is, and if it's so good for us, and it is, neurologically, emotionally, physically, it's extremely good for us. So why don't we do it? And as I began to try to do the research to answer that question, what I realized is that on some level, we truly believe email and texting is more efficient. And we have kind of structured our lives about what is the most efficient way to do things without questioning whether it's really accomplishing what we want it to accomplish. It's almost as though we've made efficiency in one sense and productivity in another the end goal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not the relationship.
Yeah, the efficiency and productivity are a way to get you to a goal. They're not the goal. And as I started sort of peeling back that layers, it took me on an incredible ride to where I really saw this really broader theme of what's behind our addiction to productivity and efficiency, why we feel like we're always short on time, and how that's affected our world and how we might change that. So that's the book that's coming next.
And so just give us a couple nuggets on what you discovered. What's behind it? Why are we all so driven to be efficient and productive?
So just as a small teaser, it goes back to the invention of the steam engine. It started almost 250 years ago. Just so you know, it's not the fault of technology. It goes back to a confluence of influences, religious, political, economic, that has led us to take this sort of flawed business practice and used it in every aspect of our lives, from running our homes to raising our kids. And at this point, it's so much a part of our culture. It's so much a part of sort of how we think life is conducted, that it's going to be very difficult to let go of it, but the stakes are very high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I always ask friends or, maybe after a keynote, the question when they maybe tell me they're overwhelmed or they have too much going on or they got a promotion but not the raise yet and they're just working 24/7 and they're grinding it and they've gained weight and their family life is deteriorating, is a question that Jim Lair, a mentor of mine, taught me, which is, what are you chasing? What are you chasing, to your point, and who are you becoming as a product of the chase? And I think when people can spend time in that question, they may find clarity around the way they want to behave every day.
And that's a great question, and Jim Lair is awesome.
Sure.
But also, there's this other question that I recently heard from Andy Puddicombe, who's the founder of Headspace, in which he basically said, what part of your efforts are about becoming and which part of your efforts are about being?
Interesting.
Because you shouldn't be always becoming. Part of your life has to be about being.
Sure. If you could leave our listeners with one thing that you maybe wanted them to wake up and do a little bit differently tomorrow or to think differently about, what would that be?
The one thing, immediate change, I would ask people to try out is to don't put your cell phone down, put it away. And I say that because research shows that just the mere sight of a cell phone's presence in eyesight affects not just your own brain and distracts you like I've described, but it also makes the other person less likely to find you trustworthy, likable, or empathetic. Just seeing it there on the table. So if you go to lunch and you just set your cell phone down on the table, that's not going to help you. So that would be the one thing you can change pretty much immediately. Sit down to lunch with your friend or whatever it is you're doing. Sit down for your meeting with your employee and put the phone away.
Wow, and that drives the connection.
Yep.
That's awesome. All right, so we end with rapid fire. So I'm going to fire off some questions to you, and you just tell me what comes up.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, favorite interview that you've ever done?
Salman Rushdie, every time.
One person you'd love to interview?
Michelle Obama.
Last book you read?
Actually was a mystery of one of the Flavia DeLuce mysteries.
All right, a book you'd recommend for our listeners?
It's called Mind Wise by Nicholas Epley.
Mind Wise. Okay, I'm writing this down. I'm getting it. An app that you use most often?
Headspace.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve, people who are late.
I got it. What brings you the greatest joy?
My dog and my son.
Awesome. So this show is called Game Changers. So one last question. Who is a game changer that inspires you and why?
I'm going to say J.K. Rowling.
Why?
Because she's so good at what she does. She's not one of those people that earned a ton of money and then forgot what it was like to struggle. She is just a tireless voice for the powerless. She's given away. She's the first person, I think, to not be a billionaire anymore because they gave away so much money.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, she's phenomenal.
So have you interviewed her?
No.
All right, girl. Well, that's got to be on your list then. Let's do this.
Yeah, she totally is. Absolutely.
All right, let's do this. Celeste, thanks so much for coming on. These tips are amazing for the people that listen. For me personally, I'm super grateful. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for asking good questions.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.